as we have always been saying, that we have done more than 260 odd webinars since our inception. And these webinars, we have been very lucky. We have had the best minds on most contemporary issues from across the world. And these contemporary issues are not only pertaining to economics or socioeconomics or only sociological, but also geopolitical. We have been very fortunate to host 3 Nobel laureates. We are hosting another Nobel laureate on institutions, 2024 Nobel laureate in February. And then we are hosting another Nobel laureate again on institutions in March. The reason why we are emphasizing institutions, because if we have to be Viksit Bharat, institutions will play a very prominent role in days to come. That's why the 2 Nobel laureates who have worked on institutions, we have invited them to come and speak to us. Now, today's topic is again a very interesting and very contemporary topic. We are in the midst of the Mahakumbh, and we can see lots of resurgence. 45 crore people are going to have the bath in the holy Ganges, and actually at the Triveni, where Ganges, and then the knowledge river, or we call it the river which is not visible, Saraswati, and then Yamuna. This is the Triveni at Allahabad, and you know that we are in the midst, the whole country is enthused with the type of and the religious fervor we are in. So today is one day I thought when Professor Dr. Sriram mentioned that he has come out with a book, we thought it would be a good idea to discuss this while we are in the midst of all this religious fervor being celebrated in our country. To chair the session is Professor Malhotra. He is a friend of mine. He is presently Chairman Food Commission of Madhya Pradesh, constituted under the National Food Security Act of 2013, in which 60% of the Indian population is given free food. Prior to his current position, he served as the member secretary, very prestigious position, of the Indian Council of Social Science Research from 16 to 22, 6-year stint. He was a professor of economics and has worked with the Department of Economics, Chaudhry Charan Singh University, Meerut. He has supervised various dissertations on different topics of 8 PhD scholars and more than 40 MPhil scholars. He has been on our with us at EGROW a couple of times earlier, recently on the union budget, and he'll be again with us on the day of the budget. The speaker today is Sriram Balasubramanian. He is the reputed economist and author whose key areas of interest include global macroeconomics, economic trends in emerging markets, new growth models, and Indic dharmic culture, and an innate passion for India's socio-economic happenings. He has also been earlier with us, and he's, I'm sure, going to be with us again. But this book that he has written, Dharmanomics, has got quite a bit of publicity in our own country. And I understand, I think the Prime Minister has also appreciated him about his book. So this book is now, and recently, so this book is now in the current scheme of things, quite popular in our country. With this brief introduction of the 2 illustrious speakers, one joining us from India and the other, Mr. Sriram, is joining us from Washington, D.C. It is 7:30 a.m. there. He agreed to come and speak to us at that early hour. I know his office must be about to start, but with this brief introduction, I hand over the session to Professor Malhotra to conduct the proceedings. Professor.
Thank you, Professor Singh. I suppose that I'm sufficiently audible. That's right. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Professor Singh, once again uh, for inviting all of us, in fact. And I'll say to me personally, more because of your affection, right? And less because of the scholarship. In fact, to be honest with the things, uh, my compliments to EGROW, Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, which has organized more than 260 such webinars. And as Professor Singh just informed us all, that in lot many webinars we had Nobel laureates. I was thinking that Professor Singh only organizes under EGROW banner the webinars only, but we had some physical seminars also under EGROW banner, uh, to which I also witnessed at certain points of time. Uh, it's my fourth occasion that I'll be talking to, listening to, and sharing uh, my thoughts and listening to the thoughts of Dr. Balasubramanian. I remember in June 2024, uh, EGROW organized again this webinar on his book Dharmanomics for Modern Times. Then, during the launch of the book in November 2024 at uh, Constitution Club in Delhi, we met and we discussed a lot many things between us, Dr. Balasubramanian, and I know Dr. Sanjeev Sanyal was also there at the time of the release, and we shared many things among us. Balasubramanian was one of the panelists during the Indian Economic Association's conference in December 2024 also, when we organized a session on India's knowledge contribution in economics. Now it is fourth occasion that we'll be listening to him. And in fact, he has prepared a presentation for today's webinar. Professor Singh has already given his brief introduction. As far as his books go, so Jamba, the Joint Family, Kautilyanomics for Modern Times, and now this Dharmanomics. And when Dr. Balasubramanian writes this book, he also gives us an idea of what is there in his mind as his next work, on which he has already started to work uh, in the context of Viksit Bharat, in fact, and how this dharmic economics is going to contribute towards India being a developed country by 2047. As far as the inspirations for this work are concerned, of course, Kautilya's Arthashastra is one major inspiration behind this work. Dr. Balbir Singh Sehag's work, Kautilya, the true founder of economics, and Kautilya on moral hazard, poverty, and systemy is another work which I suppose is somewhere inspiration behind Subramaniam. He makes a mention in his introductory part itself of the book, because I had this opportunity of reading this book twice, one at the time of its release, and now when we are going to have presentation from Dr. Balasubramanian. So Angus Madison's work, who happens to be a British economist and did a voluminous work on the world economy, a millennial perspective. And in volume 2, he talks about historical statistics. So these two major works, and if I talk of what has happened recently on these issues in India, Professor V.R. Panchmukhi has contributed significantly in this area. And very recently, we had a book from Professor Satish Devthar of IIM Ahmedabad entitled as Economic Sutra, Ancient Indian Antecedents to Economic Thoughts. Those of us who have little idea about India's freedom struggle, they may have seen Tilak's work called Gita Rahasya also. And I'm very, very sure Dr. Balasubramanian has a very, very good idea of Gita Rahasya also. I was thinking when we were talking about Chanakya and ideas about economics or economic thoughts in India, some 3,000 to 4,000 years back. I'm just amazed to think that Adam Smith, the Scottish economist and the philosopher, we know and we heard from him only 250 years back, starting from 1776 somewhere. So this is on the basis of which the wealth of nations, the entire, let's say, the Western theory of economics is based, and most of us have studied that and have been trained in that. Dr. Balasubramanian has prepared his PowerPoint presentation for today's discussion, and he definitely would speak in detail about how history, culture, civilization, politics, statecraft, which in modern times is also known as governance, law, and economics, and above all, the philosophy of dharma or religion, they converged into one, and they decided the fate of India for long more than we call it. I mean, if we go by the history that we know, more than 2,000 years, and if we go a little back, and now we have sufficient evidences of that in the book itself also, then going up to 4,000 to 5,000 years. So all these things combine together to decide India's fate in the past, and India led the whole world through its not only darshana, but or philosophy, but also through its expertise in engineering, medicine, physics, astronomy, mathematics, industry, shipping, literature, culture, town planning, and many more fields that still remain to be studied. So I would like to stop here itself by saying that our guiding principles of life in Indian philosophy, or our four Purushastras, Dharma, Arth, Kama, and Moksha, they have been guiding principles of India since ages. Dharma has been the foundation of politics, economics, law, statecraft, well-being, and even ethics in all facets of life in India's case. So I'm very, very sure that dharma should define economics, and economics must incorporate dharma in each and every aspect of it, because it is the binding thread that combines and that shapes the future of the mankind and defines how individuals' welfare gets linked with society's welfare, which further links with nation's welfare. And finally, we have a global perspective of well-being also. I'm very, very sure that we would have a very illuminating discussion and presentation today. So I hand it over to Dr. Balasubramanian for his presentation. Dr. Subramanian, since we have few questions before us, which Dr. Singh has mentioned in the beginning itself, and maybe some more people from audience would be raising their questions or will be coming out with their observation. So I believe that you can take 30 minutes, nearly 25, 30 minutes to complete your presentation, as we would definitely be interested in listening to your responses to the contemporary questions and maybe some of the observations. So over to you, Dr. Balasubramanian.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Malhotra. Dr. Singh, for always being kind and inviting me for EGROW webinar sessions. I think EGROW Foundation is doing a fantastic job of providing an objective platform for a variety of thinkers to share their thoughts and research. I'm very grateful for that. And of course, Professor Malhotra has been very kind and an important supporter of some of my work. He was there for the launch of Dharmanomics at Constitution Club a couple of months back, and has been a very important votary of such ideas. So thank you once and all for both of you for facilitating this. I'll try to quickly run through the presentation, and then we could have a question and answer session. So let me just share the PPT. Just give me 1 second. Okay, are you able to see this?
Yes.
Yes, now we can see that.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll quickly run through some of these slides.
Can you make it full
Sorry?
Can you make it full screen?
Yeah, full screen. Okay. 1 second. Yeah, is this okay? Yeah. So before I begin, I wanted to quickly give a perspective
Not now, sir. It is
about.
not.
It is not visible. Sorry.
It is visible, but not at the full screen.
I've put full screen. Give me 1 second.
I think we can go ahead with that, and when we come to rest of the slides, I think they'll be still more visible, because
Okay.
I've gone through those slides also.
It is downside, sir.
Right.
Right side down.
Right.
Downside right.
Yeah, I tried
At the arrow.
this. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
I'm there. There up. Yes.
Okay, can you see this now?
Okay.
Is this fine?
Well, it remains of the same size, but I think we can continue.
Okay, sure. So thank you. So before I begin, I wanted to give a sense of my research. There are a couple of research ideas which I focus on in my books. Overarching research ideas. I think it's important to lay that before I get into the presentation. The first research question which I deal with is the role of indigenous economic models. What is the Bharatiya indigenous economic model? That is an important question I try to address through my research, through my books, especially on Kautilyanomics for modern times and Dharmanomics now, which is a sequel to that. And the second question is, what is the role of cultural norms, narratives, and its impact on economic decision making, both at the individual level of individuals as well as at the corporate level, in terms of businesses and at the policy level. This is another important research question. Through my research, I sort of believe that a lot of these ideas which emanate through this dharmic way of life has current relevance in terms of some of these behavioral choices that people make, and it's important to try to understand them. Of course, this is not a pontification of the past, but it's an attempt to understand the past in a more rigorous analytical manner, and yet use first principles which can enable us to understand the Indian economic ethos in a much more inclusive, in a much more coherent manner. So this is the broad context to some of my research. Of course, I think I'll start off with this chart with which Professor Malhotra mentioned on Angus Madison, So Madison's ideas played an important role in in triggering my interest in some of these topics. Of course, Madison talks about um, um, from 0 CE onwards till about 17th century CE. He talks about how India, Bharat, and China were the top economies in terms of GDP and GDP per capita through this time. And of course, from his assessment, uh, um, uh, the trend lines and the numbers reflect such a trend. And this sort of triggered my thought process. Um, how did this prosperity happen? I believe that intuitively that this prosperity was not somehow a one-off case or did not happen uh, through just mere population, but there had to be some level of thinking behind it, some level of an economic philosophy behind it. So that led me to Kautilya's Arthashastra. I studied that for about 4 to 5 years, created this framework called Dharmic capitalism, which I dealt in my previous session with EGROW, where through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony and engaging with the world, I produced a framework and a book which deals with a lot of Kautilya's ideas for contemporary Bharat in terms of trade, in terms of inequality, in terms of labor contracts, some of which I will brief in this presentation. So Dharmanomics is an extension of that. So one, as you see in the screen, there are three major components of Dharmanomics. One is Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism. Two is the Dharmic ecosystem. Three is this idea of Srini Dharmas, which is basically corporate guilds, which played a very important role in economic activity in ancient Bharat. I cover a variety of southern kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagar Empire, and Southeast Asian kingdoms, including Kambojidesa, which is basically Cambodia, Champa, which is Vietnam today, Java, and the entire Southeast Asian belt. And my argument through my research is that all of them had some level of dharma-based economic frameworks, especially in the early common era period between
Sir,
about
your slides are not moving. Slides are is
um,
frozen on first slide.
no, I'm aware, so I'm talking. So once then I'll move to the next slide. Hello. Yeah. So the what I was trying to say is so I deal with common era kingdoms in Southeast Asia as well, and um, my research tells, I mean, submits that they're all dharma-based economic frameworks with various iterations. Like in some places, there is a greater emphasis on some parts of this the three components, and that's how this book shapes up. And this is part of a trilogy. Of course, the third part of the series, which is coming up probably in a year and a half, is on how some of these ideas can be applied for Viksit Bharat. So, so this is the broad context for this. So as you see the screen, we talk about Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism. There are three main pillars, which is rule enforcing a non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, sustainable growth and welfare. Within the Dharmic ecosystem, which I'll explain a bit further, we're talking about temple-based economies, the idea of a temple and the economics around it in every village, the role of it being an important economic driver, especially as a decentralized economic driver, especially in most of the villages in Bharat, and its role in customizing and having sustainable solutions in ancient Bharat and how it played an important role. And then Srini Dharma as well. I mean, the Srinis, the corporate guilds, played a very important role in terms of driving maritime trade, especially in the Common Era period. They were modern day multinational corporations, akin to modern day multinational corporations, and a combination of them with, say, a regulatory body like FICCI or CII. and they had many locations. They were based in Indonesia, in Sumatra, they were based in Cambodia, they had offices in Vietnam, and they were facilitating a lot of trade between Bharat and China through the Straits of Malacca and other places. So they played a very important sort of driver. And interesting thing is they have survived for, again, as an institution for thousands of years. So they are institutions which were sort of independent from the state. They were very egalitarian. They had people across not just caste and creed and gender, but also nationality. You had a lot of Shrinis, which, for example, Israelis and Jews were part of some of these Shrinis because they were trading in Bharat at that time. So the Shrinis played a very important role, and I try to showcase that as well. So on Kautilya's Dharmic Capitalism, a brief sort of intro for people who are not part of the previous presentation. So this chart helps to provide you that perspective. I define dharma, like I mentioned, through ethics, harmony, and responsibilities. That is again maps to outcomes related to dharmic capitalism, which is clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, and driver of economic growth and wealth creation. And through harmony, I talk about global outlook and social welfare and well-being, and responsibilities, I talk about sustainable growth through familial, societal, and environmental responsibilities. These outcomes map to three main pillars, which we discussed earlier in brief, which is rule-based yet non-intrusive state, which means a state which is quite strict on rules, implementation of rule of law and order, like how Kautilya envisaged, but doesn't necessarily micromanage. It doesn't really tell, for example, how much we need to trade between each other, what are the types of products we need to trade between each other, and things like that. Often Kautilya is sort of criticized for his very detailed state. He might have a detail. He's criticized for being sometimes socialist, but I sort of differ with that. I feel that he might have a detailed state, but the state doesn't micromanage on how individuals do some of these activities. So one part of the pillar is rule-based yet non-intrusive state. Another important component is wealth creation via global outlook. Often we misconstrue that much of our post 1990 reforms was the sort of introduction for Bharat to the rest of the world. That's a major misnomer. I think, except for the post-independent period between 1947 till 1990, much of our ancient Bharatiya history talks about engaging with the rest of the world, both in terms of ideas, in terms of economics, in terms of trade, in terms of promoting wealth creation in a fairly active manner, and encouraging wealth creation. So I think that was an important principle that not only Kautilya had, but a lot of these thinkers, both before Kautilya as well as after Kautilya, especially in the Common Era period, that we noticed. So wealth creation via global outlook. And the last part is sustainable growth and welfare. The idea of inclusive growth through the prism of responsibilities, societal, familial, and environmental responsibilities, and having sustainability as an integral part of this dharmic way of life, which drives some of these outcomes. And then, of course, welfare as well, taking care of the poor and the needy in society. Some of the principles that we have dealt with, that Kautilya deals with, is the idea of avoiding Matsya Nyaya. The direct sort of references in the slokas talk about the necessity to ensure law order and enforcement of punishment, and that would ensure that the big fish doesn't eat over the small fish, meaning people in society, the rich and more wealthy, are not taking undue advantage compared to, say, the poorer people. It is also extended, in my view, through the prism of inequality as well, where Kautilya's approach to reduce inequality was multidimensional, because he firmly believed that people at the lower strata, either for political reasons or otherwise, had to be empowered, and the gap between the rich and the poor also had to be taken care. So this is another principle that flows through the Arthashastra as a sort of a horizontal. I mentioned that in my previous deliberations as well. Rule of law and enforcement of contracts. Again, there's a lot of literature on the law on how contracts were enforced. Kautilya had the role of kingship again becomes an important concept. Often monarchies people tend to think that the monarch controlled everything. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, while the monarch had an important sort of supervisory role on many issues, and he or himself owned some sections of land, there were still a lot of private players who were in play, who were having private land. And there were also, most of the role of this kingship was monitoring and having oversight on some of these land contracts and things like that. Property laws and enforcement. There's a lot of literature on some of the ideas that Kautilya has had in terms of property laws and enforcement. There's collective property laws. There were detailed enforcement regimes for some of these property laws, and also labor contracts and enforcement. I think there was an emphasis on ensuring that labor contracts were there even for daily wage laborers who would go into, say, construction sites. There had to be a sort of a contractual template which employees had to display, and even the daily wage laborer who often struggles to even find a contract today, there had to be some level of understanding of what the nature of work was and how how much they were supposed to contribute, and also what is the expected duration of work and things like that. So these by promoting all this, I think Kautilya wanted to ensure that the real poor are empowered, so that their voice can be heard as well, and not just the rich and poor. So rule of law and enforcement of contracts are are quite detailed, and I mentioned that in my book as well. So for folks who are interested, you can have a look at the book. And of course, this forms an important part of Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, which is one component of Dharmanomics. So coming to the Dharmic ecosystems, I think this is a very important component that I cover in this book. Before that, I just want to mention that the reason why some of these ideas of Kautilya are there in common era kingdoms is you find a lot of inscriptions in Cambodia, in Vietnam, which talk about the Kautilya's Arthashastra. It's very important to note that Kautilya's Arthashastra was discovered in Bharat in early 19th century, early 1915, when Shama Shastri translated. He got a manuscript from a pandit in Tanjavur, and he translated, and that was the first translation of the Arthashastra in modern Bharat. So for many centuries, it was supposed to be, at least the published version was not supposed to be there in Bharat. But interestingly enough, there are inscriptions in Cambodia, in Vietnam, which talk about the Arthashastra and principles of Arthashastra, which the kings and rulers in the early Common Era period sort of were inspired by. So a lot of these Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism principles, you could see that in the inscriptions, you could see that even in their sort of governance structures in a lot of these kingdoms. So that is the underlying, importance of that, even in these kingdoms. Of course, there were various iterations. For example, how much the role of the state played differed. The role of wealth creation and trade in some of these places also differed. The extent differed, but the underlying principles were similar. So that's why I bring in, Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism in this book. So another important component is the Dharmic ecosystem. So this, in very simple terms, one important pillar, not necessarily the only pillar of this Dharmic ecosystem, is the temple-based economies. For example, Dr. Singh mentioned about the Mahakumbh. So Mahakumbh is a very good example of how the Dharmic ecosystem functions, where you have not necessarily a temple is involved, but the Dharmic way of life produces a gathering of 400 million people, and the estimates of the Kumbh are about 2.5 lakh crores in terms of the revenue generated from the Kumbh. Even if we look at lower estimates, say, we look at 1.5 lakh crores, for example, with a much lower figure, it is still almost 5% of Uttar Pradesh's SGDP for 2023-24, which was around 25.8 lakh crores. So these events, I mean, these dharmic ways of life, not just at the micro level, at the macro level, have a considerable impact, and that was there, of course, in the past as well. So coming back to the temple-based economies, they played four major roles. Temples, because there's a reason why most of these temples are about an hour's drive from the coast in major destinations, whether it's Somnath in Gujarat, whether it is Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala, whether it is Jagannath Puri in Odisha. There's a reason why they were near the coast, because they served not just as socio-religious institutions, but they had many other sort of roles. One was that they were major labor aggregators, in the sense that they provided employment. Since the temple owned large sections of land, they provided employment not just for the activities related to the temple, but the entire ecosystem the temple provides. For example, the kirana shops, the tourism, the support infrastructure, all of them, served as, they serve as labor aggregators and employers for, at least the village level, for many villages across Bharat, in ancient Bharat, especially in the common era kingdoms. So they were major labor aggregators. Second, they served as banks and financial institutions. And again, that comes to the point of why they were near the coastline. Because a lot of the traders, especially the Srinis, used the temple as a financial instrument, where the temple used to loan out money at particular rates, interest rates for these, the Srinis. The Srinis used to use that as capital, and that helped to sort of aggregate their financing. So their financing model was based on temple-based financing, one of their financing structures. So they served as banks and financial institutions as well. Another important role that they played was they were sort of modern day venture capital funds. There were a lot of these local entrepreneurs at the village level, at the tier 2, tier 3 city level in today's parlance, who gained financing from temples as financial institutions. And the temples would invest in some of these entrepreneurial ventures, provide them again financing at reasonable rates based on their credit history and their past. And then once these firms start growing, they also had a sort of an arrangement where they pay back at particular interest rates. So they also served as sort of micro venture capital funds as well. And lastly, they played a very important redistributive role. I think this is something that we see today quite extensively, but we perhaps don't appreciate it enough. For example, in the Tirumala plates, in the famous Tirumala Tirupati temple in Tirupati, the Tirumala plates talk about how the Vijayanagar kings institutionalized this idea of redistribution. So, for example, they used to have sort of an endowment fund, where a lot of the rich in a particular area would invest in a sort of a fund, or an endowment, which would play an important role in governing the temple and financing the temple, and of course taking care of the religious elements of the temple first, and then also providing the capital required for the temple infrastructure and all other things. And in return, what they also did was they provided free food for people for 3 times a day. So any person who was below a particular poverty line could walk into these temples and get food for 3 times a day, for example. So this ensured that they were supplied. This did 2 things. One, it ensured that people below a particular poverty line had basic food and basic elements of food, which were supplied to them, so that their sustenance was to an extent taken care. Second, it ensured that the capital from the rich was sort of transferred to the poor in an indirect sense, using this as an instrument. This was again, in some of these kingdoms, they institutionalized this, like the Vijayanagar Empire, and in some of the other kingdoms, they actually had it indirectly, without sort of an institutional setup. And it's also important to understand, for example, the distinction, surprisingly enough, that much of these temple-based economies were core to the kingdoms in Cambodia and Vietnam, especially between 6th and 13th century CE. Cambodia, for example, is more or less landlocked, except for the southern tip of Cambodia, which is linked to the sea. So the advent of trade was not as extensive. So the temple-based economy model was central to their overall economic structure as well, both in terms of agriculture, both in terms of their economic structure. Whereas in the Cholas and the Pallavas, or the southern kingdoms, it played an important role, no doubt, but they also had other factors of production. For example, agriculture played a very important role. They also had trade, which was vast and extensive across, not just transitional trade, where they served as ports. For example, the Cholas, the Nagapattinam town served as a sort of a transitional port between Middle East and rest of Asia, something like what you see in Singapore today. And but the Pandyas, for example, traded a lot of products in their trading segment. So even within trade, between the type of trading units and the type of trading ports, there were distinctions between them. But the southern kingdoms had more of, the temple-based economies played an important role, but not necessarily a complete role in their economic structure. So these were some distinctions and differences that you see. Like I mentioned, Cambodia and Vietnam are temple-based economies from about 13th centuries. The Cholas also, and the Pallavas, Pandyas, and Vijayanagara also institutionalized this structure. So next important component of what we did, because we spoke about Cartelian Dharmic capitalism, the principles of it, and then we spoke about, or rather I spoke about the idea of a temple-based or the Dharmic ecosystem, which is driving a lot of these economic activities. And the major vehicles were the Srinis. The Srinis were basically, in very simple terms, they were corporate guilds. So if you look at this map, very interesting map, which is basically talks about from Bharat till all the way till Southeast Asia. So in most of these places, the Srinis played an important role in terms of financing and in terms of facilitating trade, especially between India and China. So they used to have, for example, offices or locations in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Sumatra, in all these places, like how multinational corporations have today. And they played, they were financing a lot of these kingdoms as well. For example, one of the reasons why the Cholas went all the way till Southeast Asia was driven by the Srinis. For example, Rajendra Chola, the son of Rajaraja Chola. Rajaraja Chola is the one who built the Brihadishwara temple, which is a UNESCO recognized temple in southern Tamil Nadu in Tanjavur. His son, Rajendra Chola, he conquered Southeast Asia. But once they went to Southeast Asia, they did not rule Southeast Asia. There's a reason why they went all the way to Southeast Asia, but did not rule these places for a long period of time. One of the reasons is that there was a guild or a Srini called Ain Nurvar. It's called 500 in Tamil, which was very large and very important Srini, which played a very important role in trade across Asia as well as Middle East. So this Srini was traveling. I mean, the Straits of Malacca between basically Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia today was a very important trading outlet, and the king, especially for people to trade to China, the king who was ruling Indonesia in the Srivijaya kingdom had sort of strangulated this Srini. They did not want this Ain Nurvar, this 500 group, to thrive. So they started putting a lot of restrictions. They affected their trade. So since they were financing the Cholas, and the Cholas wanted to free their commerce, they went all the way there to fight the battle with the Srivijaya kingdom and ensure that commerce was happening, and commerce was enabled. And so they had an alliance with the Cambodian kings and fought the Srivijaya kingdom in Indonesia. and enable the Ainur world to continue their trade practices across Asia. So what I'm trying to say here is that, there are a couple of very interesting observations. One, these Srinis were extensive. They were driving commerce rather than the politicians driving travel to the rest of the world. So they played an important role, and common people played a very important role in going across oceans for commerce and engaging the rest of the world. I think that's a very important observation. Second, these Srinis were very egalitarian in nature because of the fact that they were in these multiple locations and they were dealing with multiple kingdoms, and they as a unit they were very egalitarian. They had people across board. One of the questions that was asked earlier was whether women and their role in ancient Bharat. I think a lot of the Srinis were open to people across gender and across caste, and they were also open to people from various nationalities. For example, you had Israeli Jews, some Greek traders who were part of some of these Srinis, and there were a variety of these Srinis. And the interesting thing is they were governed by a set of principles based on Dharma. And I think that's an important part. For example, the Ainur Srini, which we spoke about, one of the larger entities, were inspired by this concept called Bhaijanya Dharma. So similarly, each of them had their own governance structures, and their governance structures were, they used to elect leaders democratically. They had a system with which, their governance structures were sort of inclusive as much as possible, and that is one of the reasons why they sustained for such a long period of time, despite the fact that there were a lot of wars happening. For example, over this 1,500 years or plus, even within the southern kingdoms, they were all fighting continuously. But yet, the Srinis as an institution somehow thrived during this period. And that, in my view, is based on some of these principles and ideas that, and these dharmic principles and ideas and governance structures which were underpinning them. And this is an example of, there is some evidence to suggest that they were there even during the Saraswati Sindhu civilization period, which is a much larger period. So at best, the Srinis were there for 1,500 years. There's an extension which can go even to 2,500 years and plus. And the Srinis, it's important to also understand how they are similar to a modern day corporation. This is a very important table. For those who are interested, this is a very important paper by Professor Vikramaditya Khanna. He's a professor at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, professor of economics and law. So he talks about how the Srinis were, what are the similarities between a modern day corporation and these Srinis. So, for example, they had a centralized management structure. They had management which was selected through a sort of a process. You could remove management from these roles. They had liability insulation, for example, which is again a corporate principle. Formation, exit, and creation and exit of Srinis or people from Srinis was also a fairly easy process. It was not too cumbersome. And they were registered with the state, but they were also independent from the state. I think that's an important point. Even though the Srinis played a role in financing some of these kingdoms, the state did not play, or did not micromanage how these Srinis were governed. They were fiercely independent. And then their sharing of assets and liabilities, so terms of agreement and additional rules were also done. Board and committee independence. So Dr. Khanna also says that there's a probability of, yes, they also had an independent sort of governing structure. Voting regulation. Though it's not too detailed, but they did have a voting system, or at least a concept of a voting system. There was also open debate in some meetings. Of course, there were some limitations as well. And transparency and disclosure. I think the inscriptions themselves give an idea of their approach to transparency, where a lot of these things, were sort of inscribed for people to see in the future. Similarly, the Uttarameru inscriptions, which some of you might have heard, which talks about democratically elected local leaders in a village near Kanchipuram, was also during this Chola period as well. So these are some of the underlying principles of the Srenis, which are sort of similar to what I would call in a modern day corporation. So I think besides their similarity, um, there are a few fascinating things like what I mentioned about them. I think the first thing is they were important drivers of maritime trade, important drivers of economic activity in ancient Bharat. They were quite egalitarian. They had democratic systems to sort of elect people within their units, and they also had governance structures which for each of these Srenis, which are underpinned by these principles of dharma. And more importantly, they were the sort of flag bearers of I would say I would say ancient engagement with the rest of the world, not just in terms of ideas, but in terms of trade, in terms of products, going to other countries and things like that. And they were ahead of the political class. In fact, a lot of the political class followed the Srenis into a lot of these other countries and engaging with other countries. So basically, the common folks in ancient Bharat were the ones who were pioneering in some of these ideas, especially in engagement with the rest of the world. So I think these are some very important elements of the Srenis. Of course, more details are there in my book for those who are interested. And I just want to sort of conclude with this perspective. I mean, this is a mountain in Cambodia in a place called Kabal, Spain, in Siam Reap, which is which is where the Angkor Wat is. As you see on the left, you see a picture of Brahma, which was created, and just next to it is Ranganatha, which is Lord Narayana, and the third image is about around 1,000 Shivlingas on top of a hill through the mountains. This was created by one of the kings. The idea was this was a river which was flowing, the main river into Cambodia, and they had to they constructed this and saw it as a divine sort of foresight, and it still is there. So for those who are interested, what I'm trying to say is, irrespective of whether you agree or disagree, I mean, visiting these places is a marvelous insight into how some of these ancient civilizations functioned. And I think it's important to sort of take a step back and look at these with an open mindset, and try to look at some of these principles. I think one of the things that I attempt to do is to use some of these, or at least provide a perspective on some of these principles, because a lot of these principles, especially this dharmic way of life, is emanating in our present. So if you want to understand some of these ideas in the present, it would help to sort of get a perspective from the past. So I would request all of you to buy the book, or please read and review the book, and of course I'll be glad to answer some questions now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balasubramanian, for providing us brief yet very explanatory view of the book. In fact, I mean, those of us who have read this book, they know it. These slides, which could not run, in fact, they provide us an idea about the introductory part, followed by 8 chapters that you have in the book, namely Shreni Dharma, Dharmanomics, Saraswati Sindhu civilization, Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, and Vijayanagar empires, Kambuz Desha, and other Dharmic Southeast Asian kingdoms, and the final chapter being Dharmanomics through 5,000 years. So I think this is the chapterization of the book, and Dr. Balasubramanian spends a lot of time when he talks about Shreni Dharma. His Shreni Dharma in the initial chapter appears as largely a theoretical part, but when he talks about different kingdoms, Cholas, Kambuz Desha, or Pallavas, Pandyas, he explains how Shreni Dharma was followed. And initially I was interested in knowing that, I mean, how he defines Dharmanomics, and he definitely starts from his previous book, Kautilyanomics for modern times, and this is where he starts from, that it is a function of Kautilya's Dharmic Capital, and then builds on Dharmic Ecosystem and Shreni Dharma. So these are three components of his Dharmanomics that he tries to explain in this book. There are few questions, Dr. Balasubramanian, which Professor Singh made a mention about. In fact, there are many things that fascinated me in the context of this book, and there are many maybe questions and maybe queries in my mind that would need an answer. I would speak about that in the concluding part of that, but initially we would take some of those questions. Dr. Singh, you are very much here. I think there was a question in the chat box also, decline in moral values among the youth in India, right? Why we are not in a position to keep a check on that or stop that, number one. There was a question on immigration laws in the United States after Trump's coming into power. It's less related to the book and maybe more related to the fact that Dr. Balasubramanian is based in United States. And that is why the audience would like to hear from you. The third question relates to MSME, how Dr. Balasubramanian puts MSMEs in the framework of the Dharmanomics, and the view about female labor participation rate as they have not been given share in the wealth, in fact, as a result of that, how he looks at the female labor participation rate. Dr. Singh, I think these are the questions, major questions that are there before us.
Yeah, I just want to supplement the one on migration. Actually came from not because he's stationed in USA, but because the view is that we were a very modern economy,
Okay.
and lots of trade was there. In such circumstances, when we were an open economy, the golden sparrow of the world,
That's right.
what was our attitude towards migration? So in Dharmanomics, because it's a 5,000 odd year civilization, and that is why. Now that you have given me the opportunity, I want to add one more question. And Mr. Sriram, in your presentation, it became so apparent, and you mentioned it, and this question was asked to me in the morning today itself. And that question was regarding basically the issue of temple property. You said the temple was the center stage, also served as a venture capital, and also served as a banker, and also served as an economic nerve center. That's a very good point. The question that was asked to me in the morning is that there was a provision there that the temple property can be taken by the king and should be regularly taken away by the king. And also mentioned that in today's circumstances, in the famous temples, gold is being replaced by some other metal, and therefore it gets dark within no time. And there is a fear that the gold which has been offered to the gods has been misappropriated. So the question that was asked is that in times of our Dharmanomics, what was the status of temple property? And could the king, in emergency or otherwise, appropriate it? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Malhotra, for giving me the chance.
Dr. Balasubramanian, I mean, I think you have heard all these questions. If I need to repeat, I'll repeat it for you. Right?
No, it's fine, Professor Malhotra.
That's fine. So what is your own idea on these issues? In fact, we understand that nothing in this world exists in finality at one stage. So we would like to just hear from you.
Right. So on the issue of immigration, right? So let's start with that. So see, how I approach these subjects is again on what I call addressing first principles, right? Because it's very difficult for us to even go into contemporary leaders' minds to know what they are thinking, right? So we are talking about thousands of years back. So if you look at the principles of ancient Bharat, one thing is very clear, like what Dr. Singh mentioned, right? that we were very open to engaging with the world, which means you had various types of traders, various nationalities, different types of people who were coming into Bharat. So much so that I've given this example in this book that in the Pallava kingdoms, there was around a period of 730, early 7th century CE. One of the kings, passed away and he didn't have any lineage. One of his relatives, previous relatives, had migrated to Cambodia. And so the folks from the Pallava Empire went all the way till Cambodia in Kambuji Desa and in Vietnam in Champa, found out the lineage of this particular king who had gone over there, and offered his sons the kingdom. And his third or fourth son, who was 11 years old, accepted the kingdom, and he became Nandivarman II, who built the Kanchipuram Vadaraj Swami temple in near Kanchipuram, which is very famous even today. And he became one of the biggest Pallava kings. What I'm trying to say is that they were egalitarian enough in those times to choose someone who was born abroad as their leader and made him one of the, and he became one of the flag bearers of the Pallava Empire. Okay. What I'm trying to say here is this is the sort of mind frame that ancient Bharat had, in my view, right? Of course, the idea of a nation state is a concept which was not there, right? So what I think would, our principles or our ancient Bharat would, how they would have dealt with this is, they would be definitely open to engaging with people and having a migration, but whether that would convert into citizenship is a different story altogether, because I think that involves the role of a nation state. I think the underlying principle in the United States is also that, right? I mean, the argument is, one element of the argument is, of course, is race driven, and I would say that is still a minority. But I think that the major principle or the debate is whether migration should translate into citizenship, right? A lot of the European countries or most of the other countries don't necessarily transfer that to citizenship. So I think that's sort of a debate. But from our context, I think this is a sort of a approach based on principles of the past that one would that I would think would apply. On the role of the temple-based economies and land and things like that, right? So I think we need to draw a distinction between the role of the state and the temple, which is a political issue even today, right? Governance of the temple and on what a temple as an institution, once you go into a temple, say what the temple itself does, and the ecosystem around the temple. See, the ecosystem around the temple is less controversial because, it is, for example, the tourism and the kirana shops and the entire infrastructure that is required to provide, temple-based economies of scale is different from the temple and its own revenues by itself, right? I think one needs to draw that distinction even today, right? Even in the past, I think that distinction was drawn. So answering a question, I think the state had a lot of control. I mean, they had control over the temple in some cases, not all cases. There were also private institutions which served as temples. But the state had for a variety of reasons. But the ecosystem around it in terms of land and things like that, I think it is on a case-to-case basis. I mean, of course, the monarchs had some control over it. But the temple also served as an independent institution. They were also run by a group of independent people in that particular locality, in that particular area. For example, the entire sort of endowment fund model, where there's sort of a governing structure, which were sort of people who were there was a mechanism to sort of administer some of these lands which belong to the temple. What I'm trying to say is it is not necessarily always the king and the monarch taking control over all this. I think that's a very naive perspective. I think there's a lot of gray in between, and it was a combination of governance structures and the state also having a role in some of these things. So that's how I would view that distinction. Another question is, I think, the role of, I think, women and caste. I think that's another, important question. See, the role of women, I think I've mentioned, at least in the perspective of the Shrinis. I am, and there's a lot of literature on some of these early, women entrepreneurs who were there in ancient Bharat. So, of course, it is not extensive enough. And it's important to understand that there are a lot of these shortcomings also in the past. And those are things that we need to move away from. And of course, encourage more labor force participation, enable women labor force participation. And the Srinis were playing that sort of a role, in the sense there was nothing stopping, people from across caste and creed to participate in the Srinis. In fact, ironically enough, I mean, not ironically, but surprisingly, though the Srinis, across various castes, could participate in the Srinis, especially those that were linked to, say, the business caste. For example, the Chettiars in Tamil Nadu, who were sort of a business community, and they played an important role. So a lot of these, I think the caste dynamics did not, especially in the Srinis, did not play a discriminatory role, but rather a commercial role. I mean, where it was used as some sort of a social capital, right? Of course, how it functioned in day-to-day governance at the non-economic level, I think that's a different story. But I think we should all. I mean, I think even in any modern construct, it's common norms that in an inclusive society you want barriers on caste and gender to be to go away from it, and have equal opportunity for everyone. And I think if there are any things in the past which is contradicting to this, we have to, move away from it and take the positive lessons out of this experience. So that's how I would view, I deal with this in some parts in my book, but another important distinction I also would like to draw is Kautilya's Arthashastra is very religion agnostic, in the sense you would rarely find in the entire text any mention of any of these, not even merely any religious sort of mentioning. It's meant to be a sort of a very religion agnostic book. So that is an important distinction. Why I'm saying this is we're talking about 3rd century BCE. So then itself, I think there was a view that some of these policy inscriptions had to be, for people across board. And that's how Kautilya wanted it as well. And he himself acknowledges that, for example, in the Arthashastra, he talks about Brihaspati, he talks about Shukracharya, he talks about their ideas. He talks about how there's disagreement that he has with their ideas. So there's a constant sort of an academic churn on some of these principles and ideas and variations. And there were various variations, even in the common era kingdoms. Some of the kings and some of the, they had, certain preferences. But institutions like Srinis, ideas like trade, like engaging with the world, inclusivity, sustainability, these ideas, I would call them as, they became a bit more eternal. They were there for a much longer time. And I think it's important to understand this, because an extension of all these experiences is what we are living today. Because especially on the discretionary expenditure side, most of our discretionary expenditure today is all linked to our cultural way of life, if you really think about it. For example, the highest number of UPI transactions per week this year was during the week of Diwali, right? So what I'm trying to say is a lot of discretionary expenditure in today's Bharat, whether it's the Mahakumbh, whether it is all linked to the cultural aspects of our country. And unlike the West, here this is intrinsically built. There's a lot of literature from the West. For example, George Ackleroff, former Nobel Prize winner, he's written a lot of literature on identity economics, the role of norms, narratives, and its role in economic decision making. And there quite a bit of literature in the West. And in Bharat, it's very intrinsic to, and not just in Bharat, but also in Asian societies. I mean, if you look at the Chinese model of governance, a lot of it is sort of inspired from some of their ancient principles. Similarly for the Japanese. And I think because Asian societies in general have where their cultural ways of life makes an impact on their economic choices, both at the individual level, also the corporate level. Let's take the top 15, 20 firms in Bharat today. They're all family-driven firms in some form or the other. And most of these firms, even though they're publicly listed, are governed by ideas and principles which are a derivative of their cultural mores, whether you like it or not. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not taking a judgment of what is right and what is wrong. There's not another important point is this is not a moral judgment. Morality is an important part of it, yes. I mean, as for an assessment, but I am trying to say that this is what the reality is. This is how much of the informal structure that we spoke about. We talk about the informal sector. The informal sector in today in Bharat contributes to about 75 or even 80% of the employment in the country, even by latest numbers. And most of the informal, economies or informal kirana shops and informal entities, small, medium businesses, are all driven by things like trust, things like familial units. They are the, financing of, they provide financing for a lot of these units. For example, if say the local kirana shop in your street in Delhi goes bust, the first thing that would happen is some member of that particular family of that individual will try to ensure provide some financial support for that person. If that doesn't happen, that individual might go to a local, guy who's giving them financing at probably exorbitant rates. But if they have some credit history, hopefully they go to a bank, which gives you a much more better rate. But what I'm trying to say is a lot of the local small and medium based businesses work on values such as trust, values such as, local community development. And a lot of the, the villages have local flavors that drive economic activity. So for example, I heard recently the Uttar Pradesh government has instituted one product, one village concept, where each of the villages, there is this particular product which plays an important commerce role, and they try to promote those products. What I'm trying to say is a lot of, as you travel more and more in the country, one realizes, especially in the villages, that there are a lot of customized local economies of scale. And these local economies of scale are driven by this dharmic way of life. So it could be the temple-based economic system, it could be the cultural tourism system, it could be local products and local flavors, which drive a lot of this economic activity. And if you are supposed to empower tier 2, tier 3 cities and build economies of scale, this is a very interesting model which is already there, which can be done in a far more targeted manner. So I think the informal sector, I deal with a lot of this in my next book, but if you're going to be Viksit Bharat, there are two major areas that we need to take along the way. One is a huge informal sector. The transition, I'm not saying that, the transition to a formal sector needs to be conclusive. I mean, what do you do with the informal sector? How do you move them into the realm of Viksit Bharat? The second is the entire rural way of life and rural economies of scale, tier 2, tier 3 economies of scale. So I think these are important questions that we need to answer. And I think some of these principles and ideas can provide us some base for understanding some of these, thought process. But anyway, so I think I addressed the informal sector. Yeah. So is there any other question, Professor Malhotra, that I missed?
Well, I could see one more question in the chat box, that how Dharmanomics model could practically be implemented in today's India, and how it could be further embedded into policy making. So that's one more
Right.
question.
Right. So
And what would you like to say about the let's say the decline in moral values, especially among the youth in India?
Yeah. So on the first question, see, I deal a lot more in detail in the book, but I think from a policy making standpoint, of course, wholesale changes is not practically feasible, not desirable in my view. But I think where it is useful is on the margin. So, for example, if there is a policy which is, say, effectiveness of a particular policy is, say, 60%, this sort of an approach can enable effectiveness of policy to be 80% or further. So, an example, for example, is things like the entire Swachh Bharat movement, which I have mentioned earlier as well, where you notice in rural areas there's a far greater uh, uh, uptick of this policy because either through the prime minister or his entire machinery of the scale of the state, it is basically tapped onto this dharmic consciousness of saucha, which is basically cleanliness, which we are generally very clean in our houses. We want to transfer it to a neighborhood. So it creates a moral sort of responsibility for individuals to clean their neighborhood. So much so that when you go to even in rural villages in Tamil Nadu, I noticed that, except for the main bazaar street, most of the streets are all fairly clean. I mean, in the sense that the entire Swachhata concept has struck a chord with people so that it's almost a moral responsibility for them. So what I'm trying to say is this ensures that if this policy was effective, say 60%, 70% effective, now you're making it 80, 90% effective. So that is the level of marginal change I think that can happen by being cognizant of such of these ideas while implementing policy. Rather, so you are basically aligning policy to the way of life. Instead of a bunch of people sitting in Lutyens Delhi and in our cities, formulating policy based on their knowledge from Washington, D.C. and Columbia and Oxford, if we can align policy making to the way of life, because the way of life is thousands of years in its conception, it's not going to change, right? Irrespective of how the macro environment is, for the next Mahakumbh, there's still 400 million people going to go to the Mahakumbh, right? Even if, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, you will have 400 million people there, right? What I'm trying to say is that there is a natural way of life which is independent of the state, and it's very difficult for people to change this natural way of life. So it is very wiser and smarter if policymakers understand the nuances of this natural way of life and align their policy towards the natural way of life to make it far more effective. That way, policy making becomes far more effective. So I think this principle is sort of a guiding post of how some of these ideas can be used, for in the present. But of course, I'll deal in more detail in my next book. And on the last point, on moral decline, I'm too young for this, so I have no comment. Older people like yourself should should make an observation on this. So yeah, I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Balasubramanian, once again. In fact, you have, in your own way, and from the book also, you have tried to respond to the questions that were before us. I'm coming back to the book, in fact. There are lots and lots of information and lots of points that you make in this book, and which are worth reading, I feel. Because the success of a book, in my understanding, lies in the fact that it makes a good reader more interested in knowing the things, and there are certain things which are left somewhere, and it leaves for the author to write further on that aspect, maybe encourages the readers to read more on those aspects, and this book definitely succeeds in those dimensions of making the readers still more interested. And since there was a question around decline in moral values, especially pertaining to the young, I'll say in general it is there, and it's not only visible in India, it is visible in different parts of the world also. But this is what makes this book still more relevant in the contemporary times, that application of Dharmanomics or Dharma in politics, society, economy, in every dimension of it definitely would bring us back to the higher moral values and maybe to more cohesive and more harmony-based society. in the final chapter, I think there are few points that you have very successfully made. One point that we have been missing, that most of the countries, especially the developing one, they need to know their identity very well. And it is only through history, culture, civilization that we know our identities. I know many developing countries are said to have lost their identities in the past, and synthesis of the history that covering it for 4,000, 5,000 years and bringing it to the modern times and trying to find the thread which should be combining different phases of our own history and establishing our own identity can be very, very crucial. As far as research methodology goes, I think there are few things which one could definitely take as takeaways from the book. When you write evidence from travelogues, books, inscriptions, analytical notes, and anecdotal evidence also. So they established that what could be when we write economic history or we write economics from the point of view of history also, what kind of methodology one might need. And you did make a mention about the travelers from the Middle East, China, the Roman travelers and Greek travelers also, and how they contributed towards knowing India. And the surprising aspect is that we have been lesser interested in knowing ourselves. The others have been more interested in knowing about us, and we perhaps wanted to borrow it from them to know ourselves. So this is where the book definitely makes a point that we should be, as I made a mention in the beginning itself, that a lot many people in the recent past have written on different dimensions of history and our civilizational and economic history. There should be still more studies around that. And when you write alternate socio-economic and even political narrative to the Anglo-Saxon world, and very beautifully written, the binary of the state and the market. I think both of them have proved over time their own imperfections. And there's a whole lot of literature coming even from the Nobel laureates that they have started to talk about the imperfections in the market. And we know how states have failed to perform. So we need something more than that and something beyond this binary. So that's again a very, very well-made point. And looking beyond, you have used the word self-centered. I would have preferred to make use of the word self-interested in Adam Smithian words, in fact. So, and their driven choices in economics. All of us may have come across an article in yesterday's Times of India itself, written by K. Subramanian, India's ED at IMF, in fact, why India needs and must celebrate its wealth creators. So it is in tune with the presentation that you have made. And he writes about Shubha and Shri Suktam also. Professor Singh in the beginning itself made a reference to Kumbh, and you also made a reference and tried to explain it a little more, where 40 crore people are expected to take Snan or dip in holy waters over 44 days. A temporary city of 4,000 hectares has been established, which includes 150,000 tents and more than 3,000 kitchens. There are 150,000 restrooms and 40,000 security personnel. And apart from that, there are 3,000 AI-enabled cameras working around 24 hours, in fact, to capture the whole thing. Just on that point of migration and immigration policies or citizenship-related issues, there is a lot of literature on fairness in when we discussed at international level, fairness in mobility of factors. And I think developing countries or the third world perhaps could not argue it well to get it accepted that labor and its migrations when we talk about the mobility of capital factor, that how it could definitely draw parity from the so-called advanced world, that it is also viewed. Of course, there are few countries which have started to talk in terms of human resources. United States, and Trump has also, in his speech at the time of oath taking, did make a mention about that. And even afterwards, that he said that uh, good bearers, good people in hospitality industry, something like that. He did say. And as far as the citizenship laws are concerned, I think today itself, all of us have read that a federal judge in Seattle has halted the operation, at least in that state. So I think we are still to read and know a lot more about all these things. But overall, uh, there are certain takeaways from this, and you have very well said that there are few issues. And when we address the issue of holistic development and the kind of environmental concerns that are being talked about, I think it is high time that we take and be a votary of the bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. So it is well received. I'm very sure that the way you have talked about few, I mean, something which fascinated me was when you write, I mean, while writing about Champa, the present day Vietnam, that the kings built temples and made them after the dharmic names such as Panduranga, the present day Penrang, or Vijaya, the present day Bindin. So it definitely makes readers still more interested how different languages are associated or how different languages have influenced each other. When I traveled through different parts of the world, I know, and in several countries, including Switzerland, I could understand that how different words have been formed, how they have got influenced by Sanskrit, uh, which is said to be the oldest language of the world, and how Sanskrit definitely, through trade, investments, maybe interactions, cross-country interactions, it might have definitely influenced and prospered other languages and the cultures of the world. So, Professor Singh, finally, thank you to you and EGROW also for such a fascinating presentation by Dr. Balasubramanian today. And I'm very happy to see that it was a very serious kind of thing, and the mode in which this discussion took place. Number of participants raised very important questions. I can understand that every question does not need to be settled at the time when it is raised. And maybe our future endeavors, maybe our future writings will be addressing those questions in a little more detail. And secondly, this 1 hour is too short a period to respond to everything which would need an exhaustive treatment at the end of the author. So Dr. Balasubramanian, once again, thanks to you for such a fantastic effort. First in terms of writing this book, and now in taking it forward in terms of writing another good book. And I'm sure, because I've been telling people that when India looks to being a developed country, and I was discussing it with Professor Singh also, India definitely needs to definitely address many issues which are complex, but they would definitely need a resolution in terms of the very high quality of the human resources, including the moral values that somebody raised a question about. So those issues would definitely need to be addressed. Basic civic sense, basic logic, common sense, and taking it to the highest possible level for the service of the mankind and the nation and the society. For we call it moksha. I do not know whether that would definitely be suitable in the present frame of things, but at least for self-satisfaction, I think that is the need of the hour. And I'm very sure Dr. Balasubramanian will be taking these things forward in his next work. And all of us would have occasions to meet, interact, and listen such kind of very, very illuminating discussions in days to come. Thank you, one and all. So over to you, Professor Singh.
Thank you very much. I see a hand has been raised by Nagesha. Nagesha, do you have a pressing question? Or your questions have been answered because I saw your hand right from beginning? Nagesha? Okay. Muthu Vijayan, Professor Malhotra, if you permit me, can we allow Nagesha and Muthu Vijayan to ask a question? And
One
if
minute, 1 minute each, 1 minute.
1
each.
minute each. Yeah.
Sir, good evening, sir. This is Nagesha. Sir, I want to just, it is an observation. It's really wonderful presentation, Balasa. And I wanted to even the time and may not permit you to answer. We see the declining moral values or use compared to the senior professor who are sitting here, which small anecdotes, values which they have observed, giving values to the teachers and the elders, which is completely deteriorating, which I wanted to connect it, the particularly the current youth, with respect to we are following the Western culture, in the name of Western culture, so that these values are deteriorated. Nobody listens to the parents. Whereas, in the name of work, the Western, the good ethics of workaholic features, we are not following. Particularly in the public sector, how do we can we connect it? I may expect the answer. It's just my observation. How can we fix this paradox?
And then there was another
Thank
gentleman,
you.
Vijay. Hello.
Could I ask, sir?
Yeah, please be brief, as chairman has said.
Sir, in the recent UGC guidelines have come, sir, but some of the people are commenting in the future, government is going to encourage the astrology, all these native things. Recently, Indian knowledge system, that was the topic covered in Yojana also, sir. Government is going in Indian knowledge system. What about future of India? Some of the people are commenting, and our present speaker is also speaking on Dharmanomics. What is the comment of Malhotra, sir, and other sir?
I think, Professor Malhotra, that question is actually addressed to you.
Okay. See, Professor Singh, I mean, I would try to answer because Dr. Balasubramanian, he said that he would prefer not to comment on that decline in moral values of youth. So basically, I feel that it's a general decline, not only among youth, because youth follow their elders only in a society. So it is for parents and for teachers or teaching fraternity, in fact, for all of us to present an example for the youth so that they can. I have been repeatedly saying at different platforms, ethics are not to be taught, they have to be practiced. Once you start practicing ethics yourself, the society is bound to follow it. So your generations would also definitely follow it. As far as IKS in the new curriculum is concerned, I think efforts are going on. And for different papers, there is an idea of including Indian knowledge system or a part of the Indian knowledge system in the context of that particular paper in the curriculum also. There are different committees which have been formed at different levels. For primary and secondary education, I know NCERT has taken the lead, and UGC has also written to the universities to have this paper, have credits also for this paper, and make it part of the curriculum somewhere, and where this literature of the kind that Dr. Balasubramanian has come out with. The good thing, again, this book I find is that there is an exhaustive list of the literature that he himself has studied. He writes that the kind of assumption that he makes in the beginning itself. So these are good things, and I'm very, very sure that lots of scholars will have a lot of learning from such kind of books, and they would have basic ideas. As I said, that today's methodology is going to be, especially when we talk in the context of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary framework, the methodologies have to be slightly different from what we have been talking about, and maybe the kind of text we are going to write, that that would definitely decide the kind of methodology that we are going to follow. So it is with this idea in mind, I think that changes are happening, and the changes are further expected to happen. With this, I leave it to Professor Singh. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Malhotra. Thank you so much, Sriram. Excellent discussion, as you have seen from the response and participation. Very, very informative, very knowledgeable, and something which is telling us about our own past, which we all should have been taught in history, but we have not been taught, unfortunately. So I'm really thankful to you for this presentation that you have done. Well-researched, scholarly work. Thank you very much. Now, I must announce that this recording will be available by tomorrow noon, and it will be on our website. Next Friday is an important day for India. Our economic survey will be presented. And as you know, economic survey takes a sweep of the last 1 year. And therefore, the next Friday we are dedicating to the economic survey. And and the day after that, February 1, we are going to have a discussion on the union budget. Professor Malhotra will be chairing that session too on February 1. So I'm going to invite all of you before you are polluted by the TV channels and high pitch speakers there. We'll have an economic analysis of the budget as much as is possible on day one of the budget itself. So I'm going to invite all of you for the discussion on the union budget at 5 p.m. next Saturday. And next Friday, we are doing an economic survey analysis. That will be around 4 p.m. I'll send you the flyer for both the events. With that, let me once again thank each one of you. It's nearly 8 o'clock and we have more than 50 people in the audience. Thank you very much for being with us patiently. And once again, thanks to Professor Malhotra and Sriram from USA speaking to us on this important issue. Good night and see you next week. Have a great weekend. Thank you. We have the Republic Day coming up. I'm sure we are going to be watching the beautiful parade on Sunday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Namaste.